All right, so I'll be talking about relating tsunami deposit characteristics to flow conditions, and I'd just like to start by acknowledging my co-authors on this study who've been thinking about this problem for a long time. So to start, I'll go over the motivation for the study, and then I'll explain the conceptual model that we're testing with our field data. Then I'll show you the field data and look at some of the relationships that we see, and then talk about the ongoing work that we have on this project. So the overarching goal of our study is to quantitatively constrain tsunami wave magnitude using deposit characteristics. And the main sub-questions of that I'm going to be focusing on in the talk today are what deposit characteristics are controlled primarily by tsunami flow depth, and then how do other variables outside of flow depth influence the deposit characteristics we see. So the field data for this study comes from 50 study sites in 7 tsunami events. The earliest is Papua New Guinea in 1998, and the most recent Japan in 2011. And at each study site, we have data on tsunami flow conditions and deposit characteristics, and also topographic data. And so in this data set, we see an opportunity to look at the relationships between flow conditions and deposit characteristics across depositional environments and tsunami events. So the basic conceptual model that we have for tsunami deposition is founded on this erosion deposition equation, where on the left, the change in bed level with time is related to 1 over the concentration of sediment in the bed times these 2 sets of terms that I've colored blue and red here. So the spatial gradients, which are describing the change in the flow of suspended sediment and bedload sediment in the X and Y direction, and the temporal gradients, which is describing the change in the volume of suspended sediment in the water column with time. And for tsunamis, it's thought that the majority of sediment transport occurs in suspended load because particle settling velocities are low relative to shear velocities. So deposition from suspended load can occur due to either spatial gradients or temporal gradients. However, if the dV/dt term is controlling deposition, so the volume of suspended sediment in the water column decreasing during temporally decelerating flow, we would expect that deposit thickness would be controlled by how much sediment was suspended in the water column, which is a function of flow depth. So this is under those specific flow conditions, deposition conditions, this is the relationship we would expect to see between tsunami flow depth and deposit thickness. So for a deeper flow depth, you have greater flow velocities, which result in greater bed shear stress and a larger volume of suspended sediment in the water column. And then as flow decelerates temporally, you get a thicker deposit. And we can look at how grain size can affect this relationship. So for a given deposit thickness, if you increase the grain size, you would expect a deeper flow to have formed that. And now I want to take a look at how that theoretical relationship compares to what we see in our field data. So for this figure, we have flow depth in meters on the x-axis on a log scale, and deposit thickness on a linear scale on the y-axis. And as you can see, there's a good deal of variability in the data. For example, for a 2-meter flow depth or a 15-meter flow depth, you could form a 1 centimeter deposit or a 20 centimeter deposit. So really you have this large danger zone in which it's hard to tell from a low flow depth or high flow depth, or it's hard to tell from a thin or a thick deposit whether you might have had a low flow depth or a high flow depth. So several authors recently have been investigating the flow depth deposit thickness relationship, and recently Goto et al. In 2014 looked at this relationship in field data from Japan from the 2011 event. And they found a relationship between the flow depth and the 90th percentile of deposit thickness. And that relationship is plotted in this orange line on the figure. And they attributed this to a maximum envelope for tsunami, for deposit thickness, which means they saw an upper limit to deposit thickness that was controlled by the height of the water column and the concentration of suspended sediment in the water column. And so we attempted the same analysis on our data, and the fit was not nearly as strong. And I'll talk about some of the reasons why that probably is occurring. So now I'm going to explain some of the reasons why tsunami flow depth is not the only control of deposit thickness, and introduce you to some of the other important variables in this relationship. So, of course, tsunamis often consist of multiple waves, and each wave is capable of eroding or depositing sediment, and also each wave could have a different flow depth. Contributions to deposits from sediment transported in bedload will increase deposit thickness with all else being equal. Spatial sediment transport variations caused by topography or vegetation or structures can cause erosion or deposition to occur in specific areas. And differences in sediment source, like variations in grain size or limitations on sediment supply, can also affect deposit thickness. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail about bedload, topography, and grain size, and use some examples from our data set. So in the conceptual model, I said that suspended load is thought to dominate tsunami sediment transport. However, this is not always the case. Some tsunami deposits have significant contributions from bedload, and an example of where we've seen this in our data is Conceptual, Chile, after the 2010 tsunami. And in these pictures, you can see planar laminations and bed forms, which are typical of deposition by bedload transport. And the thickest data points we have in our data set come from Constitución, Chile. And local topography can also affect deposit thickness. An example of where we've seen that is in Sumatra following the 2004 tsunami. This transect shown here, this is a plot of deposit thickness and topography. And you can see it for this transect, topography was a dominant control on deposit thickness. Deposits thicken in swales and thin on ridges. And when we looked for this relationship in our entire data set, we did see it when you have a positive slope. So when elevation is increasing as you move landward on a transect, deposit thickness is slightly more likely to decrease. And as elevation decreases when you move landward on a transect, deposit thickness is much more likely to increase. And I also wanted to show how grain size can play into the flow depth deposit thickness relationship. So this is a similar figure to what we were looking at before, with flow depth on a log scale on the x-axis and deposit thickness on a linear scale on the y-axis. And now we have plotted with a color map the mean grain size of the deposits, with brighter colors being coarser grain sizes and darker colors finer grain sizes. So if you look at a line of constant deposit thickness, you'll see that as you increase flow depth, the mean grain size of the deposits does increase. And this could be explained a couple ways. One explanation would draw upon our original conceptual model where we said at a greater flow depth you have a greater flow velocity, and thus you could you could transport coarser grain sizes. However, this is an unlikely explanation in the case of tsunamis, because typical tsunami flow speeds are going to be capable of transporting the entire range of grain sizes on this plot. So another potential explanation is that as you move landward, flow depths decrease in a tsunami, and you also have coarser grain sizes being deposited first, resulting in a landward finding of the tsunami deposit as flow depths decrease. So in our original conceptual model, we said that if this dV/dt term was dominating the deposition from tsunamis, we would expect a certain relationship between flow depth and deposit thickness. And we've seen that this is often not the case by looking at the data. But we do think is that part of every deposit is being formed by this term, and so we think that these parts of the deposit can be identified by looking for internal layers of tsunami deposits, and they can be characterized by grading. So suspension grading, it's a specific type of normal grading in which the entire grain size distribution shifts towards finer sizes as you move upward in the deposit. So the coarser grain sizes are falling out of suspension first. And this is characteristic of sediment falling out of suspension in the water column. And in this figure here, we're looking at grain size data from Papua New Guinea. And from 1 to 6 centimeters with the white lines, we've identified a suspension graded interval in this deposit. So to recap, we've looked across depositional environments and tsunami events at the deposit thickness flow depth relationship, and we've seen several variables that can be very important outside of flow depth in determining that relationship. And now to return to the original goal of improving tsunami hazard assessment by developing the ability to quantify tsunami wave magnitude from a deposit, I would suggest that it's going to be important to be able to quantify the relative contributions to deposition of all of these important processes to achieve that goal. And so that's what we're going to be working towards with our data set now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions. Please.
I wonder about distinguishing those portions of the deposit that are related to temporal and spatial gradients by comparing nearby pieces of the deposit that are in low spots versus high spots with respect to the portions of the deposit that are continuous between those two would be related to temporal gradients, and the portions that are present only in the local lows would be related to spatial gradient in the low.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Summarize the question.
Repeat the question, please.
Oh, okay.
You have to summarize the question. So.
Yeah, he said he made a comment that a good way to distinguish distinguish the different types of deposits formed by spatial versus temporal gradients would be to look as you move across topography, look at the parts of the deposit that remain constant and the parts that change. And that's definitely something we've been thinking about, and we do have a lot of data at our disposal that I think would be useful for looking at that. So yeah.